Support for College Matters comes from T-Mobile for Education, the trusted connectivity partner helping colleges and universities modernize, innovate, and stay connected for what's next. Visit T-Mobile.com/highered to learn more. This is College Matters from the Chronicle.
They're using this power from the federal government to influence who colleges admit, who they hire, and even who gets to be president of the universities.
As political battles in higher education rage across the country, the Commonwealth of Virginia has proved to be among the most active theaters of war. In the space of the past few months, the president of the University of Virginia has resigned, hoping to stave off a government investigation of UVA's diversity practices. The president of George Mason University, facing a federal investigation over similar matters, is fighting to keep his job. While the Trump administration's higher ed agenda looms large in these stories, so too do state-level politics, and those are shifting mightily. Last week, Virginians elected Abigail Spanberger, a Democrat, to be the next governor, flipping control of the executive office in a state where Democrats already hold a legislative majority. To talk about the big battles underway in Virginia, I'm turning to my colleague Jasper Smith, a staff reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education, who has covered the unfolding saga in the Commonwealth and writes regularly about race and politics in higher ed. Jasper, welcome to College Matters.
Thanks for having me, Jack.
I'm so excited. This is your first time here. Are you ready?
I'm so ready.
Okay. I really wanted to talk to you about this because I know you've been writing a lot about Virginia. How would you describe what's happening in the state? Why do you think it's significant?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jack. So I think to start, it's really important for our listeners to understand that there's two really big cases unfolding in Virginia right now. And, both are, some level dealing with this national backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. As we've been reporting, the Trump administration has been going after DEI, across the federal government and now in higher education. And both the University of Virginia and George Mason University have been targets of these federal investigations relating to their diversity practices. So what we're seeing is a lot of scrutiny toward any steps that these universities have taken in recent years, specifically, after 2020, to diversify their faculty, their student bodies, to make commitments to diversity initiatives. And the consequences have been significant for these college leaders, for their campuses. Jim Ryan, the president of the University of Virginia, resigned over the summer. And Gregory Washington, the president at George Mason, is twisting in the wind as this drama unfolds currently. So we can drill down some of those individually, but I think what's really important is just showing how these universities in Virginia are being subjected to extreme political pressure, both at the state level, but also at the federal level.
So we're talking about two universities in one state, but I didn't bring you here just to talk about that. We're always interested on this show about the grander theme. What's this story really about? What's your take on that, Jasper?
What's unfolding at these two universities is about what's happening across the country right now. Higher education is at the forefront of this war that is DEI. About this idea that diversity initiatives are giving people of color, women, other marginalized groups these quote-unquote unearned benefits at the expense of their white or male counterparts. More broadly, it's about how the Trump administration is working to reshape how colleges and universities do business. They're using this power from the federal government to influence who colleges admit, who they hire, and even who gets to be president of the universities. We've seen some of that happen in the deals that have been cut, with these high-profile private colleges like Columbia and Brown and Cornell. But here it's a little bit different because we're dealing with public universities. And so state politics are very much at play here, especially Virginia, the Commonwealth. And those politics, after this gubernatorial election are changing pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into George Mason first. You've done a lot of reporting on that, and there's been some news of late on this. The Republican-led House Judiciary Committee released a report recently looking at diversity-related hiring at George Mason. What does the report say exactly?
Yeah, this report was interesting, somewhat of a Thursday news dump, if you will. So it's
Sorry
50
about that.
right. I had to cancel my Orange Theory class for it, but it's okay. This is more important. In 50 pages, this report accuses Gregory Washington of lying to Congress about his involvement in implementing what they call race-based policies and hiring practices that sought to match the racial diversity of the faculty to that of the student body. Now, this report cites testimonies from 3 George Mason administrators, including the current dean of the law school, Ken Randall. And he claimed that Washington told the dean that there were too many Asians in the hiring pool for a top position. One anonymous administrator also testified that the university deans would be punished with budget cuts if they didn't comply with the diversity goals. Randall also told the committee that, quote, you'd get fired if you didn't have a plan, unquote. The quote also obtained several documents from various GMU schools as evidence that the university implemented racial quotas in hiring.
So tell me a little bit about Gregory Washington. What's his story?
Yeah, Gregory Washington was hired as George Mason University's first Black president in 2020. Part of the reason why he was hired was because of his success at diversifying the faculty at the University of California at Irvine, where he was the dean of the engineering school. And what's really unique about Washington, I think, is that he came in swinging with his commitment to getting similar results at George Mason. And what I think is important to understand is that while about 30% of GMU's student body is white, nearly 60% of their faculty is white. And so to Washington at the time, that was a glaring disparity. And to a lot of college leaders in 2020, this was a big goal of theirs, was to diversify the faculty. And so less than a month into his tenure as the president, he established this anti-racism task force, which sought to examine the university's systems, its policies, practices, traditions, and to see if racial bias existed. And if it did, he said at the time that he would work to eradicate it. And so Washington and these other administrators on the task force were pretty explicit about their goals to increase faculty diversity. And so Washington's task force and the initiatives that came from it have since drawn the ire of the Trump administration, and it's at the heart of this judiciary report and so many of the other investigations that have come out of the Trump administration at this time targeting George Mason University and Washington himself.
So he was very explicit about these goals of diversifying the faculty. He talked openly about it. He put things in writing about it. This report that came out of this congressional committee might be dismissed as partisan, but at the same time, the implications here are that this was illegal activity and that he lied about doing it. How does the report complicate Washington's public defense?
Yeah, it complicates it in quite a few ways. Since this controversy, since this report has kind of blown up, Washington's lawyer, Douglas F. Gansler, he's called the report racist, and he's called it a display of political theater from House Republicans that have really made it their mission to go after college leaders at this time. So he said that the diversity goals were a recommendation from the university's equity advisors, which were part of, this task force, but they weren't requirements. And so they've been adamant that this was not a requirement. He also denied claims that anyone was punished for not implementing these goals. But the report challenges the validity of that defense in quite a few ways. The House committee obtained documents from multiple schools at the university that show explicit requests to hire faculty of color at specific percentages. And that's where things get kind of testy. So, for example—
That sounds pretty prescriptive, right?
Yeah, that's what the House Republicans are worked up about. As part of their investigation, the committee obtained documents from the School of Policy and Government, which outlined goals to hire 12 tenure-track faculty at a ratio of 33% underrepresented minorities and 50% minorities.
I see. So they've got some receipts here, it sounds like. How has Washington responded to the report?
So after the report came out, his lawyer sent a letter to the university's board leadership, which, thoroughly disputed its findings. Gansler described the investigation as wholly incomplete and heavily biased. He described the report as, quote, no more than a thinly veiled attempt to take down George Mason's first Black president, transposing Jim Crow-era tactics into the 21st century, end quote.
Yeah, I gotta say, if you want a quotable lawyer, Gensler's your guy. This is not an uncommon type of response from him. I've been emailing him a little bit over the last few weeks, and we have tried to get Gregory Washington on the show multiple times. His lawyer has said that they've advised him not to speak to the media, but we have a standing invitation for him to come on this show if he'd like, and the same goes for Jim Ryan at UVA. But we should talk about the governing board at George Mason, which is a key piece of this story and what's happening there. So the Board of Visitors is supposed to have 16 voting members. And if current Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin had his way, it would be stacked with his GOP allies. But a number of Youngkin's employees have been blocked by Virginia Democrats. They won't let them be seated. And the board is essentially frozen now. They can't reach a quorum, so they essentially can't do business. They can't fire Washington even if they wanted to. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right. The board is effectively frozen, and in a way that's good for Washington. The board has very conservative members who would probably agree that he needs to go. The board's rector, Charles Stimson, works with the Heritage Foundation. It's the conservative think tank that has been very critical of the university's DEI efforts. And Heritage, as many people know, is the group behind Project 2025, which has basically provided the blueprint for the Trump administration's higher education agenda. There are certainly people who think that the rector's heritage connections are a problem. Democrats in Virginia have said that he should recuse himself from any discussions about the president's future, and they cited his conflicts of interest. But of course, this could all change with the Democratic governor taking power in the state. It could be a big departure from what we've seen with the Youngkin appointees.
Right. There's a sense that Youngkin appointed some pretty far right-wing people to the board to exact an agenda. Is that your sense from faculty on campus?
Absolutely, Jack. But I think, Washington's saving grace is almost the board, because they haven't been able to make quorum to, make any decisions about whether they're going to push him out, to fire him. But also, I think it's important to highlight the support that he's had. I was at the board meeting when everyone thought that he was going to get fired in August, and it was filled with faculty supporters, with students that were really putting a lot of pressure on the board to keep Gregory Washington. Now, whether or not that pressure can, save him in the long term, it's hard to say. But it is important to note that a majority of the faculty, especially the faculty senate, a lot of the students I spoke to and other faculty members, staff, want to keep Washington as their president, and they thought that he's been doing a great job. But a lot of the pressure to, oust him is coming from conservative faculty, from the law school, and some of these more conservative members of the Board of Visitors.
Right. So we're in this weird stalemate. Then you have a new governor. You've got this congressional inquiries being accused of lying to Congress. How do you see this all ending there?
I mean, that's the big question here, Jack. Can Virginia's universities ever really say, we're safe? For all intents and purposes, DEI doesn't exist at George Mason anymore. This investigation is retrospective. I mean, it's looking at past policies. DEI was eliminated, in the resolution in August. So George Mason could really say there's nothing left here to dismantle.
We'll be back in a minute. Today's higher education leaders are rethinking connectivity, from hybrid learning and research collaboration to campus-wide digital transformation. That's where T-Mobile for Education comes in. As a trusted partner to colleges and universities nationwide, T-Mobile delivers scalable, secure connectivity built for innovation, resilience, and student success. Learn more at tmobile.com/highered. I wanted to tell you about a podcast that I think you might enjoy. It's called Learning Curve, and it explores what happens to education in the age of generative AI. It's from Jeff Young, a former colleague of mine here at the Chronicle. There's so much hype around AI right now, but Learning Curve cuts through that to examine both the promises and challenges of this fast-moving technology. And Jeff's not just talking to tech leaders and educators. You'll hear from college students living through this moment, giving their unfiltered views on AI, even as they try to find their footing on this shifting ground. So check out Learning Curve on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
So, Jack, I know you've been talking to people at UVA. Is the sentiment similar there to what I've been hearing at George Mason? are people in Charlottesville asking, how does this all end?
Very much so. So just probably a short history of the University of Virginia's travails makes sense here. Between April and June, the Department of Justice was just bombarding the university with letters and demands. The DOJ launched numerous investigations of the university's compliance with civil rights laws. And it's very similar to the stuff you were talking about with Mason. Did these DEI initiatives effectively violate civil rights law? Did it discriminate against people other than underrepresented minorities? And this all came to a sort of tipping point in June when Jim Ryan, as you mentioned, the president of the University of Virginia, resigned. And I think the expectation there was that that was what the federal government wanted, that would bring an end to this sort of environment of investigation and even persecution. But what's interesting is that it actually kind of didn't bring things to an end. The university, under interim leadership, entered into this agreement with the Department of Justice last month, and it's not one of the most onerous agreements that we've seen across higher ed if you look at some of the other deals at Columbia and so forth, but it's significant in that it doesn't close the investigations of UVA. The DOJ said it would suspend these investigations for 3 years while it gets these quarterly reports from the university about its compliance with civil rights laws. So now UVA is essentially under this microscope for another 3 years, and the president, under penalty of perjury, is going to have to sign off on reports saying they're not violating civil rights laws. You will know this too, Jasper. I think it's worth mentioning that in the eyes of the Trump administration, civil rights laws are a lot more restrictive than what a lot of lawyers and people in higher education think. Their interpretation of civil rights laws is that things that are so-called racial proxies in admissions, which might mean recruiting in an area that's predominantly Black or Latino, that might be a way that you're trying to boost your underrepresented minority enrollment, and that might be unlawful. So it's a very expansive notion of civil rights laws, and I think that's very worrisome to people at the University of Virginia. And there's a sense there, as you say, that this will never be over. There's a black cloud looming over the university, and I feel like faculty feel that.
So, Jack, what are you hearing from professors on the ground about that?
Well, I spoke Monday with Jerry Seidman, who's chair of the Faculty Senate, and she said faculty are pretty divided on this. There are some people that I think had essentially made peace with this and said we're going to have to give them something. There are other people who thought UVA would kind of fight to the death to never have to agree to anything with the federal government. I think that's sort of part of the UVA ethos, and they were very disappointed that this happened. But where there's universal consternation, I think, is that Ryan's resignation was not sufficient to bring this to an end, that they are in this precarious under the microscope relationship for at least another 3 years. And I asked Seidman about that. I said, did people on campus think that Ryan's resignation would be enough?
That's a non-trivial cost. A president can be simply a figurehead who's known to significant donors and administrators, or a president can really be the symbol of the university. And President Ryan was that. Students knew him, parents met him at move-in, faculty, even who weren't in administrative roles, had opportunities to meet him. So it was a significant cost to lose him. That seemed like should be enough.
So, Jasper, you could hear in that answer that faculty at Virginia feel a little bit like this was a bait and switch. We gave you our president, you want more? There's an emotional piece to this that I think we should talk about a little bit. You're messing with our people is kind of the sentiment that I pick up in Virginia. Do you sense that deeper emotional component at Mason too?
Absolutely, Jack. And I think what's important to really understand that emotional component, we have to go back to 2020 at George Mason and at hundreds of other colleges and universities around the country that were responding to the Black Lives Matter protests, that were responding to the George Floyd protests, where students and faculty were demanding that universities make commitments to support Black students and faculty and underrepresented groups. As someone who was graduating high school myself at that time, hate to age myself, this was a real thing.
You're not aging yourself on this podcast, Jasper.
This is a real thing. Students were looking for universities to signal, the commitments that they were making. This was a very intense time at George Mason specifically. Before Washington arrived as president in July 2020, protesters were demanding that the university tear down the statue of George Mason, who'd enslaved 300 Black people. And so, campuses wanted their leaders to be proactive in addressing racism and racist histories on their campus. Fast forward to today, we have a very different message. Diversity doesn't just mean racial diversity, but also ideological diversity, viewpoint diversity, gender diversity, academic background of faculty, all these different ways to define diversity. And for some faculty, specifically the Black faculty that I spoke with, they described the backpedaling of what these college leaders, meant by diversity as a gaslighting, somewhat as a betrayal. I mean, you meant racial diversity, and you meant that as something that you were championing, and now you're trying to kind of rewrite what it is that you committed yourself to.
So there's a sense that the leadership at Mason is having to kind of sand down the edges of what it meant by diversifying the faculty. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, at Mason and at so many other colleges and universities. And it's invoking a emotional response, I would say, from faculty and from students.
Yeah. Well, that's something I've heard from faculty at Mason and UVA and elsewhere as well. There's a broad sense that even if these boards are reconstituted and political tide shifts, that universities just aren't going to be leaning into racial and ethnic diversity as a desirable end that is spoken about anymore. And for a lot of conservatives, I think that's a real victory, that they see this as setting things right. For a lot of faculty and students, though, it's a sea change in university values. And that's why I thought it was important to talk to you about it, Jasper. We'll certainly continue to follow it. I really appreciate you coming here to speak with me.
Thanks so much, Jack.
On Wednesday, after we recorded our conversation with Jasper, Governor-elect Abigail Spanberger released a letter to the University of Virginia's Board of Visitors. She said she was, quote, deeply concerned by recent developments at UVA, describing federal overreach that had been unchallenged by the board. She urged the board to refrain from naming a new president or selecting finalists for the position until she has had the opportunity to appoint new members. College Matters from the Chronicle is a production of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the nation's leading independent newsroom covering colleges. If you like the show, please leave us a review or invite a friend to listen. And remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. You can find an archive of every episode, all of our show notes, and much more at chronicle.com/College Matters. If you like, drop us a note at collegematters@chronicle.com. We are produced by Rococo Punch. Our Chronicle producer is Fernanda Zamudio Suarez. Our podcast artwork is by Cottrell Thomas. Special thanks to our colleagues Brock Reed, Sarah Brown, Carmen Mendoza, Ron Coddington, Joshua Hatch, and all of the people at the Chronicle who make this show possible. I'm Jack Stripling. Thanks for listening. Support for College Matters comes from T-Mobile for Education, the trusted connectivity partner helping colleges and universities modernize, innovate, and stay connected for what's next. Visit T-Mobile.com/highered to learn more.